Hello, SD-WhoCon. I am John Lias, Director of Programming for the convention. I am thrilled to have Professor David Kyle Johnson as my guest today. Welcome, Kyle.
Hi, John. Thanks for having me on.
No problem. For those of you not familiar with Kyle, he is a philosophy professor at King's College in Pennsylvania and produces content lectures for numerous other organizations, including the Great Courses, which is how I learned about him. You can find links to all of his works in the YouTube video description for this video. But instead of me giving you information about Kyle, how about we let him share more details about himself and how he got interested in Doctor Who and some of the topics he has covered in the past. So I'll turn it over to you, Kyle. And please go ahead and tell us more about yourself and that amazing outfit you're wearing.
Oh, thank you. So the outfit got a sonic screwdriver for the tie clip here, a little TARDIS right there. And then if you were to look closely, no one else will see this unless I showed it to you. But of course, it's the Doctor's pocket watch that he traps himself in, right? Awesome. In season 3, right? With Martha, and it's like the Children of Blood, right? Isn't that the name of the episode? I really like that one when he becomes a kind of a normal human being. That's a really fun episode. I think season 3 there, although Martha is not my favorite companion, I think that season 3, I shouldn't say that. Martha's not a bad companion. She's just not my favorite companion. But Martha's a very good companion. But season 3 might be my favorite bit of Doctor Who, even though David Tennant's not my favorite Doctor either. Just that is a dynamite season 3. It's just some of the best sci-fi that's just ever been done, I think. Blink is in that season, and the Children of Blood is in that season, and the Master comes at the end of that. So good. So anyway, so my name is David Kyle Johnson. I'm a professor of philosophy at King's College. In my regular everyday work, I teach a lot of critical thinking, philosophy of science. I teach logic, but I also teach this pop culture and philosophy class. And what I have more probably publications than anything else on things like pop culture and philosophy. I edited the Inception and Philosophy volume. I just got through editing not too long ago the Black Mirror and Philosophy volume. That's sitting up here is my Black Mirror and Philosophy book. And I've written over 20 chapters for Dr. Irwin's, Bill Irwin's series, Pop Culture and Philosophy with Wiley Blackwell. So I'm sorry, Philosophy and Pop Culture. Got to put the philosophy first. So I've written, edited 3 books for that series, done over 20 chapters for that series, all geared towards using pop culture as a way to introduce a philosophy kind of to the general public. And so through some of that and my exposure through some podcasts and that kind of stuff, I got invited to do the Great Courses. If those who are not aware of what the Great Courses is, it's not a college. It is basically just an adult continuing education program. It's not certified. It's not like you don't get a degree out of it or whatever. It's just for your own edification. But they recruit professors from all over the world, experts in different topics, and you can learn about anything from Kung Fu and cooking to philosophy and metaphysics. And so they brought me on, and I have 3 courses with them. One on metaphysics, one's a kind of introduction to philosophy course. And then after that was done, they were like, we want to do something that we think people really be interested in. And that's a science fiction and philosophy course. They actually gave me an option to do science fiction or fantasy. And I went with science fiction. I'm a fantasy fan, but I'm a bigger sci-fi nerd. And so I put together this course that runs the gamut of science fiction that talks about everything from Inception to Black Mirror to Doctor Who to Star Trek to The Handmaid's Tale to 2001 to Starship Troopers I mentioned Star Trek already. There's a lecture on Star Wars as well. And trying to really try to treat it as philosophy. So with Irwin's series, you kind of use pop culture as a springboard to talk about philosophy. In the sci-fi course, I actually try to treat science fiction as philosophy, as something that's presenting an argument, that's trying to convince you that something is true. And so with Doctor Who, I have 2 different lectures where I talk about Doctor Who. One of them I talk about the philosophy of time travel. I kind of treat Doctor Who as this argument that certain kinds of time travel might actually be possible, and are they really, and what does that mean, et cetera, et cetera. And then I also have another lecture where I talk about the Doctor's pacifism, and I weigh it against the militarism that's advocated for in Starship Troopers, and then kind of look at a middle ground of just war theory. But anyway, that's the kind of thing that I do in the course, and that's the kind of thing I do with public philosophy. So you can find the Doctor Who lecture on time travel on YouTube, which is that's how John came across of my work. This is, I can get it without knocking over my Rubik's Cube here, sorry. There we go. This is the sci-fi, science fiction as philosophy. This is the little guidebook that comes. Visual lectures, it's 24 30-minute visual lectures. That's what I'm kind of known for in the pop culture world, is doing this pop culture and philosophy stuff.
Yeah, and I would definitely encourage any patrons of SD WhoCon to not only check out the videos that are available on YouTube, like I did, but also to buy the sci-fi learning, because I think they're very interesting. In fact, when I was watching the Doctor Who one, I was joking with Kyle beforehand that I thought my head was going to explode by the end of the lecture, because it made me think about things I'd never really given much thought to. And it's like, it reminded me of like Austin Powers, where it's like where he's about to go through the time tunnel again, and Michael York's character tells him, just go with it. Don't worry too much about it.
Right. Right. And you have to do that sometime with time travel stories, right? They don't make logical sense. And so you just have to kind of lay back and it's like, I'm just going to ignore the inconsistency and just enjoy it. And that's fine. Something else I just got through working on is a book on Seth MacFarlane's The Orville, which is a kind of Star Trek parody. In the first chapter of this book, we argued that it's kind of fan fiction in a certain kind of way, but I'm a big fan of The Orville. So I edited this volume on The Orville, and the last chapter in the book is mine, and I talk about time travel. And the very last thing I kind of mention is, like, it turns out that the time travel in The Orville is not actually logically consistent. There's logical contradictions in the stories, but that doesn't necessarily make it a bad story. You can ignore those, like you can use that as opportunity to kind of jump ship and not like the story, but I don't think that's necessary. I personally like logically consistent time travel stories a little bit better than ones that aren't. Like, I think Doctor Who's Blink out of the third season is a logically consistent one that is just perfect. But the fact that a story is logically inconsistent doesn't mean that you can't enjoy it. It doesn't make it automatically a bad story. And I think The Orville is still great, despite the fact that there's little logical inconsistencies in the time travel, and that's okay.
Yeah, I haven't had the opportunity to watch The Orville throughout its history, but I did watch the first couple episodes, and I found it very very entertaining. And I thought it was more true to Star Trek than what was being shown on the others at the time.
That is one of the big things that we push for in the book, is that's why a lot of people like it. And that's like one of the first chapters that talks about it being fan fiction. She really argues that that's one of the reasons that people like it so much, is it is a little bit more truer to Star Trek and what people really love about Star Trek than Discovery, than even Picard is. Not that they're bad, that I like them just fine, but they don't quite have the same kind of feeling, Star Trek-y feeling as like TNG and Voyager does. And it seems to be kind of returning with The Orville. And it just gets better. You've only watched the first 2 episodes. Season 1 just gets better and better. Season 2 is even better. I really like. I can't wait for season 3. And I got Seth. I actually got Seth a copy, like an early copy of the book, and he wrote a little blurb about it. And he was really complimentary, and I was really excited about that. So
awesome. Well, let's shift focus here, and I want to talk more about how you create online content. So, what process do you go through when creating either these videos for, say, the great courses, or for other organizations, or even for your own lectures? What kind of science fiction topics do you decide you want to talk about? Yeah, so
part of it's just to do with interest, right? What am I interested in? We'll talk, I think, a little bit later about my interest in Doctor Who. It's lifelong. And so it's things that I, am interested in and know really well. And so I want to concentrate on those. When Great Courses asked me to do this sci-fi course, I literally said to myself, I've been preparing for this my whole life, right? Like all the time I spent watching Star Trek as a kid and Doctor Who and everything, it's all going to finally pay off, because I'm going to be able to use, like, all of that time was research, right? That I could use for this, right? So part of it is interest. But also part of it is, let me talk a little bit more about this, because I kind of mentioned this a while ago. It is something that's making a philosophical argument. I really think that science fiction, pop culture in general, but also science fiction in particular, is underestimated in regards to its ability to do philosophy, not just kind of raise philosophical issues or questions or remind us of philosophical topics, but to actually make arguments. And that I try to look for things that do that are actually have a point of view or trying to convey some kind of philosophical message, and not only state it, but actually try to present premises or a reason to think that that conclusion is true or that point of view is true. And then I like to examine that. I like to look at what exactly is the argument that's being presented here, and is the argument actually good? One of the reasons is because I just think science fiction is underappreciated in that way. Logic is another one of my specialization as a logician. What I really like to do is take arguments that people give in the real world and try to simplify them and get them down to where they're understandable, so that we can then really clearly evaluate them. And so I do a lot of that in the course, in the sci-fi course, where I ask the listener, the audience, the student, however you want to think about who's listening to it. At the end of each lecture, I say, okay, so now what we're going to do, I kind of give a transition into another topic. And I say, to talk about that issue, to talk about that topic, go watch this movie, go watch this episode of Star Trek, go watch this particular episode of Doctor Who, go watch such and such, and think about these kinds of questions as you're watching it. And then when you come back, I briefly summarize the episode and say, it looks like the kind of argument that's being made here is such and such. They're making this kind of point. They're raising this kind of issue. And then I kind of, try to dig down and it's like, is that really true? Is that, is the argument they're presenting here good? If it's not, is the conclusion still true for other reasons? If it's not, then how do we know that, et cetera? A great example outside of Doctor Who, although it does come up in my other Doctor Who episode, I compare the pacifism of the Doctor to the kind of militarism that is pushed forth in Starship Troopers, the first Starship Troopers movie. And a lot of people think that Starship Troopers is kind of it's just kind of fun. It's not really serious. It's just kind of a shoot 'em up with sexy teens and da-da-da-da-da. But if you look at it a little bit closer, you realize that it's a movie about fascists. And fascism. And if you look at it a little bit closer, you realize that the fascists are supposed to be the heroes. But when you examine the story, no, they're not. They're terrible. These people are presented in a very, very negative light. And it turns out that Verhoeven and those who worked on the film were intentionally trying to espouse an anti-fascist message. That I forget, it's Heinlein, I think, that is the original author of Starship Troopers, right? And he was a fascist, right? But they are, like, he was a Nazi, and they are putting forth a similar kind of I shouldn't say Nazi. He was sympathetic to fascism, but they're trying to use that same kind of story, but get at it in a way that, like, you want fascism, I'll present you fascism, I'll present you Nazism, but all it's good for is killing bugs, right? It's not very useful, and it leads to a world that's actually not the kind of world that you would want to live in. And so, but there's clearly a philosophical message there, right? And the Doctor advocates for pacifism in a number of his episodes. And so I use those and kind of contrast them, these two viewpoints, and then talk about a kind of middle ground that's called just war theory in that lecture. But that's the kind of approach I take. I try to look for things that have philosophical lessons and try to examine them.
Okay, yeah, it actually leads into another question that I have for you was, what are some of the best, at least in your opinion, concepts and philosophies that you think you've presented over time? What are some of your favorites?
Well, some of my favorites, I really like the metaphysical kind of blow your mind stuff, right? So if you were to go on to the next lecture after the Doctor Who lecture in the sci-fi course, I talk about the issue of whether or not we might possibly live in a multiverse, whether there might be more than one universe, not as just a science fiction trope, right? But the actual real possibility that we may actually live in a multiverse. And I talk about some of the scientific and philosophic reasons for thinking that might actually be true, and what it would mean for it to be true, and could we actually travel to them, and how would we define them, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, time travel is another one that I find very, very fascinating. And one that I cover in my metaphysics course, and I also cover in lecture 13 of the sci-fi course, is the real legitimate possibility that we might actually live in a computer simulation. Mm-hmm. This is lecture 13. I use the movie called The 13th Floor to talk about this, not The Matrix. I use The Matrix to talk about some other stuff earlier on in the sci-fi course, because the 13th Floor actually raises the issue a little bit better. what happens in the 13th floor, spoiler alert, is that the people who create the simulation realize that they themselves are in a simulation, right? And this is actually Oxford professor Nick Bostrom's argument for why it is a lot more likely that we live in a simulation than we think. He actually puts the number at about 20%. That essentially the problem is that if you were in one, you wouldn't be able to tell that you were in one. But if one day exists, what we'll realize is that there's only one physical universe, but there's a plethora, there's a huge amount of computer simulated worlds. And since you can't tell from the inside whether you're in one, then all you like to answer the question of whether you are in one, you just have to think about the odds. And if there's only one physical world, but there's millions of simulated worlds, well, odds are we're living in a simulation, right? And so Bostrom argues that the probability that we're in a simulation is directly proportional to the probability that we will one day create one. If we ever do create a simulated world, epistemically speaking, it'll be a near guarantee that we are in one ourselves. And that's why I like the 13th floor, is because that's what they do. They create one and then realize that they're in one, right? So it's those kinds of issues that I find most interesting, those kind of metaphysical head blowing. Might we really be living in a computer simulation? Might we actually be living in a universe? Might time travel actually be possible? Those kinds of issues I find very, very, very fascinating.
And that brings me to my next question. Is it similar to like what I experienced? I mean, what has been the reaction of people at, say, conventions or other organizations, or even your own students, when they hear these philosophies and you're done with your argument? How do they react? And what kind of funny stories could you tell us?
Yeah, so I mean, at conferences and stuff, there's other people who do this, so there's not like a giant shock reaction. Usually, people enjoy it. It's interesting. It's they're studying these kinds of things too, right? So there's no kind of giant reaction. It's the students who I think probably have the more memorable reactions, and it's from everything to, like, when we talk about simulated world theory and the simulated world hypothesis and that kind of stuff, to like kind of mind blowing, sitting back in class and going, oh. What if this is actually true? I can't think of a good argument against this. I kind of thought this was silly at first, but now I see that the arguments are pretty good. I'm not sure what to do with myself, right? It's the same kind of reaction that, I mean, sometimes you get when you consider Descartes' dream problem. Can you prove that you're not in a dream right now? No, you can't, or whatever. But that's, I think, is pretty easy to get out of. The best explanation for what you're experiencing right now is that you're awake and dreaming, or awake and not dreaming, and so that can solve that problem. You can't really solve the computer hypothesis, the simulated world hypothesis, with best explanation stuff. Because if we do one day create such a simulated world, the best explanation will be that we are in one. And it's not unreasonable to think that we might one day do that, right? And so you have these kind of mind blown, what do I do with myself? How do I make sense of the world now? Kind of reactions out of students. And so that's kind of, the more kind of extreme side. Especially when we consider, I forgot his name. There's another one, not Nick. There's another person who talks about simulated world. It's not Nick Bostrom. Oh, and I forgot his name. Is going to pop in my head. He argues that the idea that we're in a particular kind of simulation called a peer-to-peer computer simulation. That's like if you were to play, if you play Half-Life. Well, if you play Half-Life, what's the one that my son plays all the time, the shoot 'em up game, that Fortnite. If you play Fortnite, you're not really entering, like, there's not a single world that's created that everybody enters. Everyone's world is generated for them by their own console, and then they're all just kind of communicating with each other to allow the game to happen, essentially. That's a peer-to-peer simulated world. He argues that essentially this actually would not only help explain, it would only make sense if we one day create a simulation that we're in one, but also, like, if we think that that's the kind of world we live in, we can make sense of quantum mechanics, where we couldn't make sense of that before. We can make sense of free will and personal identity, where philosophically it's really hard to make sense of those things. Like, it has really grandiose explanatory power. And so you can't get out of the problem, the computer simulation problem, by saying, the best explanation is that the world is real. It might not actually be. So it's kind of head blowing stuff, right? But the other way that my students react is In kind of in a good and kind of bad way, is they're like, I can't watch movies the same anymore. I used to just watch movies to enjoy them. And now every time I watch something, I'm analyzing it. I'm thinking about what argument are they trying to present? What point of view or do they have here? What, and is it good? Is it right? Like I look at it philosophically, and in a certain kind of way, they're like, well, that's bad because I can't just sit back and enjoy something. But in another way, it's good because there's another kind of level of enjoyment that comes with analyzing science fiction or any popular culture, any kind of fiction, with that kind of lens, with that kind of philosophical lens and thinking about it. And so that's kind of two different kinds of reactions that I get from my students. Yeah, apart from just being challenged by the philosophy itself. Philosophy can be very kind of eye-opening itself.
Well, then here's the million-dollar question.
Okay.
Do you think we're living in a simulated world?
I think Bostrom is right that I won't say that we are, but I think he's right that it is much more likely than we are willing to give it credit for. I think the actual 20% number is probably about right, epistemically speaking, that given the evidence we have, it's about 20% likely that we live in a computer simulation. The nice thing is, however, is that even if that's true, that doesn't mean that you should live your life any other way. No. You shouldn't live your life any differently than you are, because even if we are living in a computer simulation, that means I'm a computer program, but I'm still a conscious one. And so are you. And so is everyone else around you. And it's consciousness that bestows things upon people like rights and obligations and moral duties and that kind of stuff. And so it's still wrong to murder someone, even if they're a computer simulation, because you end their existence. Yeah, it's a digital existence rather than a physical existence, but you're still prematurely ending their existence. And that's still morally wrong, regardless of what kind of being they are. Think of it this way. The universe, if we realize that we're in a computer simulation, it's not that we're not realizing that we don't exist. We do exist. It's just that the nature of the world is different than we thought it was. We thought it was physical, and then it turns out that it's digital, right? But it still is real. It still exists. It's real in the sense that it is an actual thing, right? It's just the nature of that thing is a little bit different. Well, guess what? We've already kind of discovered that the nature of the world is different than we think it is, right? Like, you assume that the Rubik's Cube is a solid object, right? Well, actually, it's not. It's actually mostly empty space, right? It's made of atoms. Atoms are mostly empty space. My hand and the Rubik's Cube don't go through each other, not because they touch each other, but because essentially, roughly speaking, the magnetic fields that each of the atoms generate they repel each other, right? But this is actually mostly empty space. That doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It means that its nature is different than I think it is. And actually, if I go down even deeper and think about it, it's not even atoms, it's quarks and electrons, right? Well, those are just probabilistic quantum wave functions, right? Like they're not even actual real particles. Quantum particles don't have position or momentum until they're being measured, and they can only have one at a time. Quantum mechanics has revealed that the nature of the universe is drastically different than our kind of everyday experience tells us it is. That doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It just means its nature is a little bit different. If we go on to discover that it's digital, okay, that's really good to know. That's great. Knowledge is always good. But it just means the nature of the world is a little bit different. It does not mean, oh, well, there's no use in living anymore, or I'm not real, or I can do whatever I want. None of that follows from the idea that we live in a computer simulation.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the arguments that you make definitely, I think as our society has advanced and our science has advanced, I think we're finally getting to the point where as a society, we can accept these ideas and actually give them credence. I kind of think back to the early 80s when I was a child, and the movie Tron, which was so far ahead of its time.
So far.
Now, when you look back at it now, almost 40 years?
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, that's exactly where we're at today. So,
yeah, where we can and maybe a little bit beyond that, right? Like the kind of digital world that you can exist in, right? Your consciousness is not being pulled into the machine, right? But the kinds of ways that people interact in digital world is very, very similar to what you see, right, in Tron. It may be even a little bit better, but
yeah, I kind of chuckle nowadays when you see a lot of people, instead of actually having conversations, they're communicating each other by texting.
Yeah.
They could be sitting right next to each other.
Yep. One of the things that I actually think about in that regard, this isn't Doctor Who, it's Star Trek, but the Bynars from season 1 of Star Trek TNG, right? They basically have like little cell phones on them, and they just like shove messages into them, and they send it to the other person, and they just go through it whenever is necessary. It's very much like we do with texting, right? We just text people, and we text, and we just get to it when we can, reply when we can, and go on, right? It's this kind of constant buzzing, right? That's going on. It's not too far off. Like we're kind of turning into the Bynars in a certain kind of way.
Yeah, pretty soon we'll all get those brain chips that we've been talking about.
Yep, you just do all your cell phone stuff right in your head, right?
Exactly. All right, well, let's focus on on Doctor Who now.
Sure.
So how was it that you first learned about Doctor Who, and when did you start watching it?
So I am a lifelong fan. So some of my earliest memories are actually watching Doctor Who. When I think back to my childhood, it was on the PBS channel in Oklahoma where I grew up, OETA. It was on Saturday nights at 10 o'clock, I believe. And of course went for a half hour. And then at 10:30, Blake 7 would come on, which is another one of my favorite, 80s British sci-fi shows. I actually have the whole, you can't see it here, but the whole series of Blake 7 back here on Region 2 DVD or whatever. You can watch them all on YouTube now though. But anyway, so I grew up watching it. I don't remember what my first episode was. My first Doctor was the Fourth Doctor. I do remember that. That was the fourth Doctor was the first Doctor I ever watched whenever I was a kid. And I watched it as often as I can. And as soon as I got a VCR, I recorded them along with Blake 7. I actually have the VHS tape sitting in my attic right over here. But almost as soon as I got the VCR, OETA stopped carrying them. I got the Trial of the Time Lord. I got that season, and that was the last season they aired, and that was it. And that's all the Doctor Who I had was like half of the season of the Trial of the Time Lord. And so I just watched that over and over and over again because I didn't have any other access to Doctor Who back in the 80s and early 90s. Same thing with the last season of Blake 7. I had that, and that was it. So that's what I watched. And so went a long time with that being my only Doctor Who. But then when it was revamped in 2005, I was in grad school, and secret, don't arrest me or whatever, I was a bit of a pirate. Because this is basically the only way that you could get Doctor Who, like the new revamped Doctor Who in 2005 was not on American TV. The only way you could get it is by finding someone online you could download it from, right? And so I did, and that's how I watched them. But I'm right on it. As soon as the first episode in 2005 was out, I was on it. I was downloading it. I was watching it, and basically kept current all the way through. I've fallen behind a couple of times, mainly after Matt Smith. With the last two Doctors, I've fallen behind a little bit, but then I've caught up. I'm all caught up now. In the intermittent time after I got my PhD and I came up here, I actually made it a mission to make sure that I watched every episode, that I had seen every episode that you could possibly see that was still like available and live, right? Some of them are lost to time. But everyone that you could actually see, I made it a mission to do that. And it took me about 2 years. But I started with an Unearthly Child, season 1, episode 1, and watched one episode a night consistently as I was kind of falling asleep. It took me about 2 years. And I watched all the old Doctor Who from 1963 to 1989, and went all the way through. So I've seen every episode, old and new, at least once. I've seen some of the old ones multiple times. I know the Trial of the Time Lord like the back of my hand. And I know basically from 2005 to the end of Matt Smith, I know really, really well. And then I got a little bit busy with work and stuff. And so I've only seen Capaldi and the newest Doctor, Jodie, like once an episode, maybe a couple of them twice an episode or whatever, but I'm not as they're not like burned in my brain like some other stuff. But I've seen every episode and I've been watching it since a kid, as a short answer to that.
Well, awesome. You definitely have a Doctor Who expert in the house, which brings us to, do you prefer old or modern Doctor Who?
I really do prefer the modern, and I think just because it's a little bit more modern style, more modern storytelling, so it's a little bit more amendable to my kind of modern taste in the way that sci-fi works. I much better enjoy a self-contained 1 hour story episode or two-parter that's 2 hours than something that's split up in 20-minute chunks with a cliffhanger and that kind of stuff. I mean, it's fine. I like Doctor Who, right? And I really like some of those old stories. But a lot of them are a little bit too long for my taste. The dialogue goes on a little bit too long. There's a little bit too much meandering in places and that kind of stuff. I think that the new Who is a little bit tighter, a little bit, better told. Of course, I like the special effects better and that kind of stuff. Yep. So in general, like if you force me to choose, I'd choose New Who over old. I'd watch New Who more often than I would watch old, but still some of those old stories are dynamite. They're really good.
Yeah. So who is your doctor?
I would have to say, I've got my little plushies here that I made a mobile for my son whenever he was born. The top layer was original Star Trek. The middle layer was Star Wars. And then the bottom layer was the current Doctor Who in 2013. And it was Amy, Rory, River, and Matt Smith, right? All revolving around that TARDIS. So I had this nice 3-layer mobile that was in his room. And I had somebody on Etsy hand make each layer. So each one's a different artist that's making them. And so maybe because that's when my son was born, I like Matt Smith better. Maybe because I have a huge crush on Amy, that I like Matt Smith better. But that era, I think, with Matt Smith and Amy and Rory and River, that set of stories, the way that Matt Smith presented the Doctor as so kind of fun and jovial and kiddish and that kind of stuff. I really like the Pandorica. I really like the stories from that. So I think the Matt Smith, even though I think season 3 with David Tennant is the best kind of self-enclosed season of Doctor Who, maybe the best season of sci-fi and anything ever. Season 3 Doctor Who, the whole story of like Amy and Rory and that whole thing, I think that whole kind of storyline is probably the best Doctor Who. I really like, again, I may be biased because I have such a crush on Amy, but I really like those stories. I really like Matt Smith's Doctor. The wibbly wobbly, timey-wimey stuff that goes on. The fact that River, although we meet her first, is the child of Amy and Rory, but they don't know it, and because she's a Time Lord, and like it's that whole thing all wrapped up or whatever is just delicious. It's so good. You didn't see it coming at all. The idea that the Doctor and River are married, but they're living in opposite directions is just all of that. Like what I like about Doctor Who, I think most is the time travel. And when you get in little knots like that, those time travel knots, I just love it. And there's so much of those good time travel knots in those stories. I think that's probably why it's my favorite. So
of the old Doctors, do you have a preference?
I think, oh God, that's tough. Colin Baker, number 6. Possibly just because I watched the last half of Trial of the Time Lord like 40 billion times, because that's what I had on VHS, right? And so I'm just kind of partial to that just because I'm familiar with it. But I think probably all things considered, not either 3 or 4, probably 4, but I really like 3 as well. I like his angle on science, and I like, Sarah Jane. I think that those stories are really good. I really like the Master too, and that's when the kind of new Master, kind of comes, when the Master kind of comes into his own in season 3, and so those are really good. So either 3 or 4, I think is my old Doctor, but I don't think I could choose. Don't force me to choose between them.
Yeah, no, I understand. Let's see. Several years ago, we got a new Doctor in Jodie Whittaker, the first female Doctor in show's history. You've had an opportunity to see her portray the Doctor with her companions, and now several years worth of stories. What are your thoughts about her and her portrayal of the Doctor?
I think her portrayal is great. I think her portrayal of the Doctor is great. I really enjoy it. I think it's fresh and exciting and new. There's some very interesting developments that were in the last season of where she's I've only seen this episode once, but where she's sort of not a Time Lord, but is, right? And I thought that was like, I could see why some people would be upset about that storytelling or whatever, but none of that is Jodie's fault. So if we just talk about Jodie's, how she represents the Doctor or whatever, I think it's great. I have no objections there. I think that the writing in her episodes could be better. I also thought that about Capaldi too. I thought the writing could have been a little bit better for Capaldi. There's a couple of really good Capaldi episodes, like the one with the spaceship that's like near the black hole and the time, the time traverses, the time dilation where the time traverses at the end of the ship, faster than it does at the end. Oh, I love that. Or there's that one where he's trapped in that prison and he's having to get out and he takes a little chunk out of the ice or whatever. I thought that episode was great. But in general, I thought Capaldi's writing was a little weak. I think that the same thing is true for Jodie's. It's Jodie Whittaker, right?
Yes.
Right. So for Whittaker's Doctor, I think the writing's a little bit could be a little bit better. The stories could be a little bit better. The one that sticks out of my head that I wasn't really thrilled with was the spider one, the one that had to deal with the giant spiders, because I kind of thought, we've kind of done this before, that kind of stuff, right? But as her portrayal, I think it's great. I really enjoy her as the Doctor, and the relationship she has with the companions and that kind of stuff, I think is really fascinating. Good. I've kind of liked that dynamic, treating it as kind of a family and that kind of stuff. I've liked that. Yeah. So I mean, I think overall, I think it's good.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, I mean, I know there's been a lot of controversy and a lot of opinions, not only with her portrayal and the writing, but so honestly, I think if you enjoy it, you enjoy it. If you don't, you know what? Everybody has their own opinion. And
yeah, I've thought that. I think that there's a lot of toxicity in sci-fi fandom, not just in Doctor Who. There's a lot of toxicity in Star Wars fandom. There could be there's some in Star Trek as well. I'm a big fan of the Orville, and I actually like the Orville better than Discovery, but the amount of vitriol that people express for Discovery and that kind of stuff, it's just like, if you don't like it, then don't watch it, right? Like it seems to be the same thing with Star Wars. If you don't like it, then don't watch it. Don't try to re-edit it to make something different. Don't try to just let it be. If you don't like it, then you don't like it. You like something else. I think it underappreciates the amount of work that people put into the science fiction and that kind of stuff, to the writing. And I always think of that when I get through watching a giant Star Wars movie or a Doctor Who episode or whatever, and people, oh, that was crap, that was blah, and they start griping about it. And it's like, do you understand how much work it took to put that together, right? And you're dismissing it 5 seconds after seeing the last frame and just griping about it. I think that there's kind of underappreciation of the amount of work and stuff that it takes to do those kinds of things. And so, you can have your opinion, you can criticize, like I just criticized, the writing in the last season of Doctor Who, the last couple seasons of Doctor Who, right? But I don't think it's awful. I think it's still a good show. I still enjoy watching it. I still say keep making them, right? Like, I'm not going to disparage it. I'm just going to say, I don't like it as good as the Matt Smith era, but that's not to say anything bad about or disparage the writers at all, right? So, yeah.
Okay. So here's an interesting question. What other philosophical or science fiction tropes would you like to see on Doctor Who?
Yeah, so the more philosophy, the better, always. And I saw this question on your sheet, and I almost hesitated to ask it because I almost feel like, even though I've seen every episode, I don't have them all memorized. So I feel like no matter what I say, somebody's going to say, well, they already did that, and it'll reference some other episode or whatever. So with that said, probably they've already done this to a certain degree, but what I would like to see is I really like kind of episodes inspired by modern events, right? And especially ones that tackle kind of modern issues, right? So there's some of the really good writing with the Jodie Whittaker seasons, right? Some of my favorite episodes of that are the one where they talked about I'm going to show my ignorance, but they talk about the day that India split in two, right? Yeah. And that's really good. There was a climate change kind of global warming episode that I really thought was very, very good. And so those are the kinds of episodes that I like. So with that in mind, I would really like an episode that's inspired by kind of way and the kind of ridiculousness of QAnon, where they come across, and so it maybe pair that with also like an episode about cults where the Doctor and his companions or her companions come across a cult, but do it in such a way that like it's not like an obvious bad guy when you get into it, right? Like it looks like the good guys, they side with the good guys, and maybe even the companions are pulled into a certain degree, maybe even the Doctor gets pulled into a certain degree. and then they realize, oh my God, we've invested into a cult here, and there's all this kind of mind control stuff going on, and we've got to figure out a way to get people out of this. And they realize how hard it is to get people out of a cult and that kind of stuff. I'd really like to see an episode kind of around that. And this, I think QAnon's got a lot of cultish stuff that's going on about it. So if kind of incorporating those kinds of things into it would make for a very interesting episode. So some kind of episode that's inspired by that, I think I would really enjoy. Yeah, and there's some philosophy, there's some epistemology there that kind of talks about beliefs and belief structures and how hard it is to change beliefs once you're really invested in something. If you're to get out of a cult, you have to challenge some of your core beliefs, and that's really, really hard for some people to do. So I'd really like that kind of idea explored. But that's that's what I thought of when I saw that question on the list there. Is like, I think that's the kind of episode I'd like to see.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Here's a question I like to ask just for fun of my guests on these panels is rumor has it that this is probably going to be Jodie's last season as the Doctor, and that she'll be moving on after it wraps. Who do you think would make a good Doctor to follow her?
LeVar Burton? No, wait, that's Jeopardy. So actually, LeVar Burton wouldn't be a bad choice. I don't know. I mean, boy, that is tough. I mean, I don't know my English actors all of that well. So I don't know if I can name someone specific.
Or just a general characterization, maybe then.
Yeah, I mean,
what direction should they go? Do you think they should go in?
I think that they should stick with a female. I think it'd be a little bit too weird to go immediately back to a male after just kind of like trying the, we're just going to try the female thing once and go back to the normal. I think that would be good to stick with the female for a while. The way it should be played, I think, oh boy, I don't know. This probably wouldn't fly. I mean, what's kind of going through my mind is a kind of more serious kind of first, third Doctor vibe, right? Mm-hmm. Like a little bit more kind of grounded and serious and sciencey and that kind of stuff, rather than the kind of more jovial, I think, a depiction that Jodie gives or like Matt Smith gives, or even though I really like that, right? Maybe as a contrast, that might be something that works. As an actor or actress to play it, I can't come up with anything off the top of my head. But I like them going with people that are fairly unknown, right? I mean, Jodie, I knew Jodie from Black Mirror. She was in season 2, episode 2 of Black Mirror. And that's where I knew her from before she became, the Doctor. But other than that, I really didn't know her. I kind of like Matt Smith was the same way. I hadn't heard of Matt Smith before, or David Tennant or anything like that. So I think going with an unknown actor is actually a kind of better way to go. And so maybe I shouldn't know. Whoever would make a good choice, I wouldn't know who they were, because then they would be known. But other than that, I'm not sure. I kind of like, for me, maybe I'd want a serious one, but I don't think that would actually probably work very well. I think that would the audience wouldn't enjoy that as much as I would. And so they might have problems with viewership or people dropping off and that kind of stuff. Right.
Yeah. And unfortunately, I think Peter Capaldi is an example of him suffering through that.
Yeah.
I thought he was a magnificent Doctor, but I know his first season, he was the grumpy old first Doctor type. And so that didn't really resonate with the audience for the most part. But I always make the joke because he actually is my favorite Doctor now.
Oh, really?
And as his hair grew, he became more epic. So by the time he reached his last Christmas special, the hair alone could have been the Doctor, and I would have watched. So,
Colin Baker had a similar problem, right? Like they were trying to portray in the early episodes of Colin Baker that the regeneration had kind of messed him up and made him kind of grumpy and surly, and it just, fans did not like that very well, right? And now that you mentioned that Capaldi did kind of play the first season, his first season kind of like that, maybe I take it back. Maybe that's not what we want for a new Doctor after Jodie. So I'm not sure. I don't think I'm very good at making these decisions. I think this is why I'm a fan and not a writer. Right.
Hey, I mean, other than okay, everybody has their opinion on who the next Doctor should be. So
right. I mean, maybe what it should be is a bald bearded 43-year-old philosophy professor, right? Maybe that's who they
there we go. You could be the next Doctor, and we will all attend the lectures just like they did for Capaldi, even if we weren't in the class. So
the entire franchise would fall apart. Casting me as the doctor.
Great.
I'd love to be a companion on one episode. That would be the best. But
oh yeah, I think we all would love to be the companion on any episode.
Yep.
So, all right. Well, I just want to thank you, Kyle, for allowing me to do an interview with you today about Doctor Who and some of the work that you've done. Again, I would encourage any of the SD WhoCon patrons to check out his bio, some of the articles that he's written, some of the videos that he's done. And again, the great courses, lectures are definitely worth the investment. As I said, they really make for some deep thought. And I cannot encourage you enough to do that. I also would like, if possible, to have you participate in SD WhoCon this year. It will be October 8th through the 10th. And if you have the interest and the time, we could definitely schedule either something virtually or, if possible, technologically, or maybe a recorded panel. So I just want to send that invitation out there to you.
Yeah, that sounds great.
We'd like to have resident Doctor Who fans and experts for our guests.
Cool. Yeah, that's great. That's wonderful. I've definitely done those kind of things before. So I'm experienced in it, and I'd be more than happy to do it. So that'd be great.
Okay, fantastic. Well, SD WhoCon, again, I want to thank Dr. David Kyle Johnson for joining us. And again, check out his things and make sure that you have the opportunity to read through some of it before the convention. So that way you can learn a little bit more about some of the items that he teaches. Kyle, again, thank you.
Thank you. I have to ask you one question before we go.
Yes.
Have you ever cosplayed as a master?
You know what? I've been asked that question, and I have not.
You need to. You've got the hair for it. You got the goatee. You got the hair you could slick back. I'm telling you, it'd be dynamite.
Delgado is my favorite master by far. No obvious reasons.
Right.
But yes, I definitely have to give that some thought. I know that he would definitely be fun to play for a little bit, especially the Delgado. He was more smooth about things. He told you he was going to destroy you, but he did it in a nice way.
Yep. So. Yep. He was, that was incredible. I tried to cosplay as the 11th Doctor one time as Matt Smith or whatever. It just didn't work because it's just, I don't have the hair. So I had the bow tie and but it just doesn't work.
Yes, I have cosplay as an alternate 10th Doctor because I've got the entire outfit.
Cool. Very cool. Very cool.
Okay.
All right. Well, thanks a bunch, John.
Thank you, Kyle. Thank you, SD WhoCon. And I will see you again in the next video.